You know, when you think of a medieval knight, you probably picture a sword. You know, it's a classic image. A long, sharp, shining blade. And you probably assume the sword is made of steel. The same goes for the axe of a Viking raider or the tip of a crossbow bolt. We just connect the Middle Ages with steel weapons. It makes sense. Steel is strong, it holds an edge, it's what you'd want in a fight. But the real story is more complicated. The answer to the question, were medieval weapons always made of steel, is a simple no. Not even close. For a huge part of the medieval period, steel was a rare and precious material. A weapon made of pure, high quality steel was the equivalent of a supercar today. It was something for the very rich and powerful, not the average soldier. So, what were most weapons made of? For a long time, the answer was iron, and the difference between iron and steel is the most important part of this whole story. It all comes down to a tiny amount of a single element carbon. Iron is an element dug from the ground as ore. On its own, it's pretty soft. You can bend a pure iron bar without much trouble. An iron sword would be a terrible weapon. The edge would dull almost immediately. It might even bend when you hit someone's shield. Steel is just iron with a little bit of carbon mixed in. A very small amount, usually less than 1%, but that tiny bit of carbon changes everything. It gets into the crystalline structure of the iron and makes it much harder. With the right amount of carbon and the right heat treatment, iron becomes the hard, tough, resilient material we know as steel. It can be made sharp and it will stay sharp. It can bend and spring back to its original shape. It's the perfect material for a weapon. The trouble was, medieval blacksmiths didn't have a simple way to make perfect steel. They didn't have modern chemistry, they couldn't measure carbon content precisely. Their methods were based on experience, on trial and error, and on secrets passed down through generations. Making good steel was part art, part science, and part luck. We also have to remember how long the medieval period was. It wasn't a single, static time. It lasted for about 1,000 years, from roughly 500 AD to 1500 AD. The world in 600 AD was completely different from the world in 1400 AD. Technology changed, societies changed, and warfare changed right along with them. A weapon from the early Dark Ages was a very different thing from a weapon made at the end of the Age of Knights. The materials available and the knowledge of how to use them evolved enormously over those centuries. Geography mattered too. A blacksmith in Sweden had access to different iron ore and different traditions than a smith in Spain or Syria. The famous blades of Damascus, for example, were made from a unique type of steel called woots, which came from India. The European smiths couldn't replicate it. So, the story of medieval weapons isn't one story. It's many stories spread across 1,000 years in a vast continent. It's a story about the slow, difficult, and brilliant struggle to turn soft, crumbly rock into the perfect killing tool. It begins not with steel, but with its humbler, softer parent iron. In the early Middle Ages, after the Roman Empire fell apart, Europe was a messier, more local place. The grand Roman infrastructure, with its organized legions and industrial-scale weapon workshops, was gone. Knowledge was lost. For a blacksmith in 700 AD, life was about working with what you had. And what you had was usually iron, not steel. And it wasn't even very good iron. The main source of iron was often something called bog iron. It's literally what it sounds like. Iron ore that forms in swamps and bogs. People would harvest these lumpy, reddish-brown rocks. It was a low-quality ore full of impurities like sand, clay, and bits of plant matter. Turning this stuff into usable metal was the first big challenge. The tool for this job was a bloomery furnace. This was basically a small clay or stone chimney. You'd layer charcoal and crushed iron ore inside and light it. To get it hot enough, you needed a constant flow of air, which was supplied by someone working a pair of bellows by hand for hours and hours. It was hot, smoky, exhausting work. But even with all that effort, a bloomery furnace did not get hot enough to actually melt the iron. Iron melts at a very high temperature, over 1,500 degrees Celsius. The bloomery couldn't reach that. Instead, it created something called a bloom. This was a spongy, glowing hot mass of iron mixed with all sorts of melted impurities, a glassy waste material called slag. The smith and his apprentices would pull this bloom from the furnace with tongs. Then the real work began. They had to hammer it. Over and over again, they would heat the bloom and hammer it on an anvil. This did two things. It squeezed out the liquid slag, sending sparks flying everywhere. And it compacted the spongy iron into a solid bar. This finished product was wrought iron. Wrought iron was the workhorse metal of the early medieval period. It was used for everything from nails and plows to shields and swords. But it had its limits. It was tough, meaning it could bend without breaking, but it was also soft. An axe made of simple wrought iron wouldn't hold its edge for long. A sword might bend and stay bent. You can read accounts from this period of Viking warriors having to pause in a battle to straighten their sword blade under their foot. This was a real problem. Blacksmiths were clever and they knew this was a problem. So they developed ways to make their iron better. They were trying to add carbon, even if they didn't know what carbon was. They just knew that if you cooked iron in a charcoal fire for long enough, the surface would get harder. This process is called case hardening or carburization. You'd end up with a weapon that had a soft, tough iron core and a harder, steely skin. It was an improvement, but the hard layer was very thin and could be ground away by sharpening. The most famous technique from this era is pattern welding. This is what created the beautiful snake-like patterns you see on Viking and Anglo-Saxon swords. It wasn't just for decoration. It was a brilliant solution to a material problem. A smith would take several bars of iron, some of which were more steely higher in carbon than others. He would twist these rods together like twisting strands of licorice and then hammer them flat. He would then forge weld this patterned core into the center of the blade and then weld on separate high carbon edges. This process did several things. It averaged out the quality of the inconsistent metal from the bloomery. It created a blade that was flexible in the core to absorb shock, but had hard edges that could be sharpened to a keen razor. And yes, it looked incredible. A pattern welded sword was a status symbol. It showed that you owned a weapon made by a master craftsman. It was a sign of wealth and power, but it was also a sign that high-quality steel was still so rare that smiths had to come up with these incredibly complex and labor-intensive ways to use what little they had. They were masters of making the most out of imperfect materials. As Europe moved from the early Dark Ages into what we call the High Middle Ages, around the year 1000, things started to change. Trade routes reopened, towns and cities grew, and knowledge began to spread more widely. This had a huge impact on the world of weapons. The slow, difficult quest for better steel started to pay off. Our blacksmiths didn't just abandon their old ways overnight. The bloomery furnace was still the main way to make iron for a very long time. But they got better at using it. They built bigger furnaces. They developed better bellows, sometimes powered by water wheels, which could supply a stronger and more consistent blast of air. A hotter fire meant they had more control over the process. They learned, through generations of experience, how to create blooms that were more consistently steely. They could recognize the subtle differences in the metal by its color, the way it sparked when hit, the sound it made under the hammer. A key development was learning how to make steel more deliberately, not just by accident or in small, inconsistent batches. One method that became more common was the cementation process. A smith would take bars of wrought iron and pack them into a stone box sealed with clay. He'd surround the iron with a carbon-rich material like crushed charcoal, leather scraps, or bone. Then he'd put the whole box into a furnace and heat it for days. The carbon would slowly soak into the surface of the iron bars, transforming them into blister steel. It was a slow process, and the carbon didn't always penetrate all the way through, but it was a way to create a larger quantity of steel than before. Meanwhile, Europeans were becoming more aware of the incredible steel being made elsewhere in the world. Crusaders returning from the Middle East brought back stories and examples of so-called Damascus steel. These blades, with their distinctive watery or patterned surface, were legendary. They were said to be so sharp they could cut a silk scarf falling through the air, and so tough they could chop through lesser swords without chipping. This material, properly known as wootz steel, originated in India. Indian smiths had a completely different method. They used sealed clay pots called crucibles. They would put a mix of high-purity iron ore and carbon sources like wood or leaves into the crucible, seal it, and heat it in a furnace until the contents completely melted. As it slowly cooled, a small ingot of very high-quality, high-carbon steel would form. This crucible steel was uniform, clean, and far superior to anything being made in Europe at the time. It was a closely guarded secret and a valuable trade good. European smiths didn't have the technology or the right raw materials to make true crucible steel during the medieval period. So, what did a European knight sword from, say, 1200 AD look like? It was probably not a solid bar of wootz steel. That was too rare and expensive. It was also less likely to be the complex pattern welded sword of the Viking Age. As smiths got better at making larger pieces of decent steel, they moved to a simpler and more efficient construction. The most common method was to create a laminated blade. The smith would start with a thick bar of tough, flexible iron for the core of the sword. Then, he would take two thinner bars of precious high-carbon steel and forge weld them onto the sides, forming the edges. This gave you the best of both worlds. You had a hard, sharp cutting edge that would hold its sharpness in a fight. And you had a soft, tough core that could absorb the shock of a blow without shattering. It also saved a lot of steel. Steel was still the expensive part. Iron was cheap. This method was practical and effective. It produced a strong, reliable weapon that was affordable enough for the growing class of professional soldiers and knights. Steel was no longer a half-mythical substance. It was becoming a reliable, essential component of the medieval toolkit, even if it was still used smartly and sparingly. It's easy to get focused on swords and steel. They are the most glamorous part of medieval warfare. But they are only a small part of the picture. Most fighting wasn't done with swords, and most weapons weren't made entirely of metal. To understand medieval conflict, you have to look beyond the forge and into the forest, the tannery, and the quarry. Other materials were just as important, if not more so. The single most common material on any medieval battlefield was wood. Think about it. A spear is mostly wood. A Viking axe is a small metal head on a long wooden handle. A bow is a carefully shaped piece of wood. A crossbow has a wooden stock. A shield was made of wooden planks. The handles of swords, daggers, and knives were wood. Without wood, the vast majority of medieval weapons would be completely useless. The type of wood mattered immensely. People knew the properties of different trees, just like a modern engineer knows the properties of different alloys. Ash was a favorite for spear shafts and axe handles. It was strong, straight-grained, and good at absorbing shock. It wouldn't easily splinter or break. For bows, yew was the king, especially for the famous English longbow. Yew has a natural laminate structure. The heartwood on the inside of the bow compresses, while the sapwood on the outside stretches. This combination creates a powerful natural spring, capable of storing and releasing huge amounts of energy. Finding and shaping the perfect piece of yew for a warbow was a highly skilled craft. Leather was another essential material. Every sword needed a scabbard to protect it, and that was usually made of a wooden core covered in leather. The grips of swords and tools were often wrapped in leather for a secure hold. Leather was also used for straps, belts, and harnesses for both soldiers and horses. And it could be made into armor. A type of armor called cuir bouilli, which means boiled leather, was common. By soaking leather in hot water, or sometimes wax or oil, and then shaping it as it dried, you could create a hard, rigid material. It was used for breastplates, helmets, and limb defenses. It wasn't as protective as steel, but it was much cheaper, lighter, and easier to make. Arrow, bone, and antler were also widely used, especially in the earlier medieval period or in places where metal was scarce. Arrowheads could be made from sharpened bone. They weren't as good at piercing armor as iron heads, but they were cheap, easy to produce in large numbers, and perfectly deadly against an unarmored opponent. The inut on a crossbow, the small, crucial part that holds the string back, was often carved from bone or antler because it was smooth and durable. The handles of daggers and utility knives frequently used bone or antler for a decorative and functional grip. And we can't forget about bronze. The Bronze Age was long over, but the metal was still useful. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. Its biggest advantage over iron is that it doesn't rust. It's made perfect for decorative fittings on weapons. The pommel and crossguard of a sword were often cast in bronze. This added weight to balance the blade and looked good doing it. Buckles, brooches, and other fittings were also bronze. And in some cases, bronze was still used for weapon heads. Bronze arrowheads were common, and the very earliest cannons, which appeared at the end of the Middle Ages, were cast in bronze because it was easier to work with than iron for large, complex shapes. Finally, there was stone. It might seem primitive, but stone remained a vital military material. The greatest weapon of all was the stone castle, but stone was also used offensively. Catapults and trebuchets, the giant siege engines of the age, were designed for one purpose: to hurl massive stones at or over castle walls. And for the poorest peasant or a commoner in a pinch, a simple sling and a smooth river stone was still a dangerous weapon, just as it had been for thousands of years. The medieval world was a practical one. People used what worked, what was available, and what they could afford. Steel was the best choice for a cutting edge. But warfare was a complex business that relied on a whole ecosystem of materials. The last few centuries of the medieval period, from about 1300 to 1500, saw a real revolution in metalworking. This wasn't a sudden invention, but the culmination of all the slow progress that came before it. The changes were so profound that they transformed not just weapons, but the entire nature of warfare. The age of iron and cleverly laminated blades gave way to the true age of steel. The single biggest technological leap was the development of the blast furnace. This was a much larger and more efficient version of the old bloomery. By using water power to drive massive bellows, these furnaces could reach temperatures high enough to fully melt iron ore. The iron became a liquid and would run down to the bottom of the furnace, separating from the lighter slag. The smiths could then tap this liquid iron, called pig iron, and let it flow out. This was a game changer. For the first time, people in Europe could produce large quantities of liquid metal. This liquid pig iron was very high in carbon, making it brittle like modern cast iron. You couldn't make a sword out of it, but you could refine it. By reheating the pig iron in a different kind of forge, you could burn off the excess carbon until you had the perfect percentage for steel. This two-step process was much more efficient and produced a more consistent, higher quality steel than the old bloomery method. And it could be done on a much larger scale. This flood of good, affordable steel made something new possible full-plate armor. A knight in the year 1100 wore mail, which was made of thousands of interlinked iron rings. It was flexible and good against cuts, but it offered little protection from like a crushing blow or the point of a lance. A knight in 1450, however, could be covered from head to toe in a suit of articulated steel plates. This kind of armor was a sophisticated piece of engineering. Each plate had to be shaped perfectly to allow movement. And the steel itself had to be expertly heat treated. A breastplate needed to be hard enough to deflect a sword point, but not so hard that it would shatter like glass. This required a deep understanding of quenching and tempering, skills that master armorers in cities like Milan and Augsburg became famous for. You simply could not make this kind of armor without large, reliable sheets of steel. The blast furnace provided that. This new reality of the battlefield, where wealthy soldiers were encased in steel, drove changes in weapon design. Swords became more specialized. While the classic cutting sword was still around, new forms appeared, like the longsword, which had a longer grip for two-handed use to provide more power against armor. Pointy, tapering swords designed for thrusting into the gaps of an armor suit also became more common. The polearms, the long weapons used by infantry, grew more complex. They sprouted spikes and hooks designed to pull knights off their horses or punch through helmets. The common soldier also benefited from this steel revolution. While a full suit of plate was only for the rich, a simple steel helmet and breastplate became much more common for ordinary infantrymen. The tips of arrows and crossbow bolts were made of hardened steel, designed specifically to pierce mail or find a weak spot in plate. So, by the end of the Middle Ages, the picture had changed completely. A weapon from 1450 was very likely to be made of good quality steel. The village blacksmith was still making iron tools, but specialized weaponsmiths in major production centers were working almost exclusively with steel. The long, slow journey was complete. The story of medieval weapons is the story of a search for the perfect material. It started with soft, impure iron hammered out of a bog. It moved through the beautiful and complex art of pattern welding, a way to make the best of a bad situation. It evolved with laminated blades, a clever and economical way to put precious steel only where it was needed most. And it ended with the industrial scale production that allowed for steel plate armor and the specialized tools to defeat it. They weren't always made of steel. For most of the period they were not, but the relentless drive to create stronger, sharper, and more reliable weapons is what pushed medieval craftsmen to finally master the secrets of steel, changing the world in the process.